June 2025 was one of the most active and chilling months on America's death row. From savage home invasions to the execution of a killer who chose nitrogen gas over lethal injection, this month brought shocking endings to brutal stories. In today's video, we're diving into the final days of 5 convicted men, what they did, what they ate, and the last words they spoke before facing the ultimate penalty. Before we get into these unsettling stories, hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you never miss a deep dive into true crime and capital punishment. Let's begin. Anthony Wainwright, Florida. Anthony Wainwright was born in 1972 and grew up in a small rural town in North Florida. By his early 20s, he had already established a criminal record that included auto theft, burglary, and drug-related offenses. But in 1994, Wainwright's name would become known across the country for a crime so violent and disturbing that it left the nation stunned. On April 27, 1994, Wainwright abducted 23-year-old Dawn Lopez, a young mother of 2, from a parking lot in Lake City, Florida. Lopez had stopped at a convenience store with her children when Wainwright, armed and desperate after a string of recent crimes, carjacked her vehicle. He left the children behind at the gas station, a detail that would become a tragic and haunting image replayed in the news for days. Surveillance footage showed the toddlers wandering inside the store alone, unaware that their mother would never return. Wainwright drove Lopez across state lines into Mississippi. Over the course of several hours, he raped her and later strangled her in a wooded area. Her body was discovered days later, partially buried in a shallow grave. He was captured shortly after when authorities traced stolen credit card activity and recovered the victim's car. Wainwright was extradited to Florida, where he was charged with kidnapping, rape, and first-degree murder. The prosecution sought the death penalty, citing the brutal nature of the crime, the victim's vulnerability, and the trauma inflicted on her children. The trial drew national attention. The media focused not only on the gruesome details, but on the heartbreaking fact that 2 children had lost their mother in such a horrifying way. During sentencing, the judge described Wainwright's actions as premeditated evil. He was sentenced to death in 1995 and spent nearly 30 years on Florida's death row. On June 10, 2025, Anthony Wainwright was executed by lethal injection at Florida State Prison in Rayford. He had exhausted all appeals. For his final meal, Wainwright requested a classic Southern-style plate: fried chicken, mashed potatoes, green beans, and banana pudding. It was served the evening before his execution. Just before the drugs were administered, Wainwright was asked for his final words. He paused for several seconds, then said, "I've prayed for the victim's family every night. I don't deserve forgiveness, but I hope they find peace." At 6:03 p.m., the lethal injection began. He was pronounced dead at 6:10 p.m. Wainwright's execution marked Florida's second of the year. The case remains one of the most emotionally devastating to come out of the 1990s in the state. A story not just of loss, but of a young mother's life stolen and 2 children forever scarred by a moment of violence they couldn't even comprehend. Gregory Hunt, Alabama. Gregory Hunt was born in 1956 in Alabama. His early life was marked by modest beginnings, but as he grew older, his personal relationships grew increasingly volatile. By the mid-1980s, Hunt's marriage to Jacqueline Hunt had deteriorated. She had filed for divorce, sought protection, and attempted to build a new life for herself and their 2 children. But Gregory Hunt refused to let go. On the night of September 15, 1988, Hunt followed Jacqueline to her sister's apartment in Birmingham, Alabama. According to court records, he had stalked her movements and arrived uninvited. Jacqueline was inside the apartment with their 2 young children, ages 6 and 8, when Hunt forced his way in. Armed with a handgun, he confronted her in the living room. After a brief, heated exchange, he shot her multiple times in front of the children. She died at the scene. Hunt fled, but was arrested the next day after turning himself in. The murder shocked the Birmingham community, not just because of the brutality, but because it unfolded in front of 2 children who were left emotionally shattered. At trial, prosecutors emphasized the cruelty of the act. A man killing the mother of his children with no regard for the lifelong trauma inflicted on them. Hunt was convicted of capital murder in 1989 and sentenced to death. For decades, he remained on Alabama's death row, filing appeals that focused on mental health claims and procedural errors. But the facts of the case never changed. In 2018, Alabama introduced nitrogen hypoxia as an alternative method of execution. Hunt eventually selected it, citing concerns over the pain of lethal injection and the state's recent history of botched procedures. On June 10, 2025, at Holman Correctional Facility, Gregory Hunt became Alabama's second inmate and the sixth person nationwide to be executed by nitrogen hypoxia, a controversial process that replaces oxygen with pure nitrogen, causing unconsciousness and eventual death by asphyxiation. For his final meal, Hunt requested a plate of grilled pork chops, cornbread, collard greens, and sweet tea, a Southern comfort meal, simple but familiar. When escorted into the execution chamber, Hunt appeared solemn and calm. He made eye contact with witnesses and then gave his final statement. "I can't bring her back. I'm ready to go. I'm sorry for the pain I caused." The process began shortly after 6 p.m. He was declared dead at 6:17 p.m. The execution reignited public debate over nitrogen hypoxia and the ethics of capital punishment in domestic violence cases. Advocates for Jacqueline's family stated that while nothing could restore what was lost, they hoped this chapter would finally bring peace to the children who witnessed that horrific night in 1988. John Fitzgerald Hansen, Oklahoma. John Fitzgerald Hansen was born in 1968 and raised in central Oklahoma. His early life included run-ins with the law, mainly for theft and drug possession. By his 30s, Hansen had developed a reputation for instability, drifting between towns and struggling with methamphetamine addiction. But nothing in his record foreshadowed the violent rampage that would unfold in 1999. That summer, Hansen embarked on a multi-state robbery spree, targeting small businesses and convenience stops along rural highways. His first known fatal act occurred in May 1999, when he walked into a roadside motel in El Reno, Oklahoma. Surveillance footage captured him calmly approaching the front desk, pulling a gun, and fatally shooting the motel clerk, a 41-year-old single father, execution style after the man complied with his demands. A few days later, in western Oklahoma, Hansen's car broke down on a remote stretch of road. A passerby, a 60-year-old retired veteran, stopped to help. Instead of gratitude, Hansen pulled a gun and shot the man in the chest, stealing his truck to continue his escape. That victim died before paramedics could arrive. Hansen was eventually captured in Texas after a police chase. Forensic evidence and witness statements linked him to the 2 murders and several other robberies. He was extradited to Oklahoma and charged with multiple counts of first-degree murder, armed robbery, and possession of a firearm after felony conviction. At trial, prosecutors called Hansen's actions calculated, cruel, and predatory. They emphasized the randomness of his victims, strangers who posed no threat, who were simply in the wrong place at the wrong time. The jury deliberated for less than 5 hours before sentencing him to death. For more than 2 decades, Hansen filed appeals claiming mental illness and unfair trial procedures. None succeeded. On June 12, 2025, the state of Oklahoma carried out Hansen's execution by lethal injection at the Oklahoma State Penitentiary in McAlester. For his final meal, Hansen requested a diner-style order, cheeseburgers, onion rings, and a chocolate milkshake. At approximately 10:50 a.m., he was brought into the execution chamber. Witnesses described him as composed, with a flat, distant expression. When asked if he had any final words, John Fitzgerald Hansen spoke clearly. "I made my choices. This is where they led me. I accepted." The execution began shortly after. He was pronounced dead at 11:04 a.m. Hansen's case became one of Oklahoma's highest-profile executions of 2025, a stark reminder of how quickly a life of crime can escalate into irrevocable violence and how final the consequences can be. Stephen Stanko, South Carolina. Stephen Stanko was born in 1968 and spent much of his early life in South Carolina. By his mid-30s, he had already served time in federal prison for kidnapping and assault. But after his release, he appeared to have turned his life around. He portrayed himself as a reformed man, educated, articulate, and even involved in co-authoring a book about life after incarceration. To many, Stanko was a symbol of redemption, but beneath the surface, he remained a danger, something the state of South Carolina would learn in the most devastating way. In April 2005, less than a year after his release, Stanko was living with Laura Ling, a 43-year-old librarian in Horry County. The two had been romantically involved. According to court records, a confrontation between them escalated violently. Investigators later found evidence that Ling had been beaten and strangled in her home. The next day, Stanko drove to a nearby library in Georgetown. There, he encountered Henry Turner, a 74-year-old librarian. Turner was found later that day, fatally attacked in his office. Investigators linked the two crimes through forensic evidence and timelines, setting off a multi-agency manhunt. Stanko fled the state in a stolen vehicle and was eventually apprehended in Augusta, Georgia. His arrest shocked the public, not only because of the brutality of the crimes, but because he had positioned himself publicly as a model for rehabilitation. In court, prosecutors described Stanko as calculated and cold, emphasizing the deliberate nature of the murders and his attempt to evade capture. The jury was unanimous in their verdict. He was convicted of 2 counts of murder, along with kidnapping and other related charges. In 2006, he was sentenced to death. For nearly 19 years, Stanko remained on death row at Broad River Correctional Institution in Columbia, South Carolina. His appeals were consistently denied at both the state and federal level. On June 13, 2025, the state of South Carolina carried out the execution by lethal injection. Stanko's final meal was carefully chosen: lobster tail, baked potato, and strawberry shortcake. Corrections officials stated he finished his meal without comment. When led into the execution chamber, Stanko was described as calm and composed. When given the opportunity to speak, he delivered a short and reflective final statement. "The man I was deserves this. The man I became wishes he had never been born." The lethal injection was administered shortly after. He was pronounced dead at 7:10 p.m. Stanko's case remains one of South Carolina's most disturbing examples of a person who used intelligence and charm to mask deeply violent tendencies. His story has since been the subject of documentaries, legal debates, and conversations about parole, rehabilitation, and risk assessment for violent offenders. Thomas Lee Gudinas, Florida. Thomas Lee Gudinas was born in 1971 and raised in Central Florida. Throughout his early adulthood, Gudinas struggled with repeated encounters with the criminal justice system, mostly involving theft, trespassing, and drug-related offenses. But in April 1994, he would commit a crime that shook the state of Florida and marked the beginning of a decades-long legal battle. According to court records, on the night of April 20th, 1994, Gudinas encountered Tina Marie McQuaid, a 22-year-old woman who had just left an Orlando nightclub with friends. As she made her way to her car alone, Gudinas followed her into the parking garage. There, he assaulted her and, in the course of the attack, took her life. He then fled the scene in her vehicle. The case drew widespread attention in the local media due to its senselessness and the young age of the victim. A police investigation led to Gudinas' arrest within days. He confessed during interrogation, and both forensic evidence and witness testimony corroborated his involvement. In 1996, a Florida jury convicted Gudinas of first-degree murder, sexual battery, and carjacking. He was sentenced to death and transferred to Florida's death row, where he would remain for nearly 30 years. Over that time, Gudinas filed multiple appeals, including challenges to the constitutionality of Florida's death penalty statute. None were successful. On June 24, 2025, the state of Florida carried out his execution by lethal injection at Florida State Prison in Rayford. Gudinas requested a final meal consisting of a bacon cheeseburger, French fries, and a vanilla milkshake, a simple but classic American comfort meal. Corrections officials confirmed he consumed the meal without incident. When brought into the execution chamber shortly after 6 p.m., Gudinas appeared calm and subdued. As he was strapped to the gurney, he was asked whether he wished to make a final statement. He replied, "I failed her. I failed everyone. May God forgive me." At 6:11 p.m., the drugs were administered. He was pronounced dead at 6:17 p.m. Gudinas' execution marked Florida's fourth of the year and brought closure to a case that had lingered in the courts for over 3 decades. For the family of Tina McQuaid, it was a long-awaited conclusion to a heartbreaking chapter, one that had forever altered the course of their lives. Each of these executions in June 2025 reminds us that behind every prison wall are stories, some filled with horror, others with regret, and a few with eerie silence. Justice may have been served, but the scars left behind, they never truly fade. These final meals and haunting last words offer a window into the darkest corners of the human soul and into a justice system still grappling with how to handle it all. If these stories stopped you in your tracks, don't just scroll away. Subscribe to the channel for more in-depth true crime coverage, from death row to cold cases. Hit that like button if you believe these stories deserve to be remembered. And drop a comment below. Which prisoner's final words left the biggest impact on you?